Good morning and welcome to I-24 News Morning Edition. This is a special broadcast this morning. Today marks the 21st day of Operation Protective Edge. The UN is meeting at this time to formally vote on a statement which calls for, quote, an immediate end and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire in the Gaza war between Israel and Hamas, and scheduled a meeting at midnight of this, of course, New York time to adopt it. The statement also calls on the parties to, quote, engage in efforts to achieve a durable and fully respected ceasefire based on the Egyptian initiative. Last night, U.S. President Barack Obama called Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to urge an immediate ceasefire after the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry flew home amid, of course, Israeli and Palestinian Authority criticism of his handling of the crisis. Meanwhile, a rocket exploded in early hours of the morning in an open field in the Ashkelon area. No damage or casualties were reported. This comes after a period of relative quiet along Israel's southern border overnight, with no reports of rocket fire or sirens since midnight. There are also no reports of Israeli strikes as of now on the Gaza Strip. The IDF death toll stands at 43, and the Gaza Health Ministry says 15 Palestinians were killed by IDF fire on Saturday, 53 were wounded, and since the operation began, 1,034 Palestinians have been killed and 6,233 have been wounded. With me in studio this morning is I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Tal Shalev. Good morning, Tal. Channel 2 Foreign Affairs editor Arad Nir. Thank you for joining us. And intelligence and security expert Yossi Melman. Yossi, thank you for being here.
Good morning.
A quick update in terms of the IDF. Yes, maybe the number of targets have diminished, and thus we're seeing less attacks. Or, of course, is the IDF taking heed of what's going on internationally?
Well, the military operations have nothing to do with the diplomatic developments. It was a quiet night. This morning, 3 rockets exploded, no damage, no casualties. Practically, there is a true ceasefire, whatever you call it. The Israeli position is the IDF position. We don't fire as long as, but we will return the fire if we are shooted. I think the IDF has consolidated its positions, which is between 1 and 3 kilometers inside Gaza, and that's the security belt, security zone. Targets, in terms of targets, the bank of targets is being exhausted. I don't think there are very few targets. Most of the tunnels have been uncovered. They are in the process of being demolished. So more or less, I think the IDF is ready for a long-term ceasefire.
And in terms of, we said the tunnels, that has been the biggest threat. In terms of the tunnels, you would say that the first stage of at least eliminating the most dangerous ones have been eliminated, and thus we don't know maybe if there are more tunnels.
Well, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
The assumption is that there are more tunnels. They have not been covered. But the IDF, intelligence-wise, believes that most of the long tunnels, those who are leading to Israel, the attacking tunnels, have been uncovered, and we are talking about 32 tunnels as of yesterday, and most of them are in the process of being demolished or already being destroyed.
And Tal, of course, diplomatically, as we, of course, hear updates from the military side, the UN Security Council has met to formally vote, meaning the statement was already pretty much known and accepted. To formally vote, of course, what will that do for the Israeli leadership?
Well, first of all, it's a statement. It's not a resolution.
Right.
So we're talking about a statement that Israel was involved in formulating, and there has been some behind-the-scenes pressure, but all in all, the diplomatic pressure is mounting. We saw that last night with the phone call from Obama to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu, in many ways, is trapped. The phone call from Obama came in the middle of an 8-hour cabinet meeting, which was discussing the further options. And in any case, Netanyahu is trapped between the international pressure calling him to stop, but his political base, and not only his political base, Channel 10 poll yesterday shows that 87% of the Israeli public supports the continuation of the operation. This is something that Netanyahu definitely has in mind. Let's see what yesterday he went on is, it's already a ritual. He doesn't give interviews to Israeli press, but for the Sunday morning shows in the United States, he's a regular. So if we can take a look at what
we'll see that in a second, but I just want a clarification, of course, about the UN Security Council statement. This is going to be a statement that, nevertheless, it's not a resolution, but it will put a kind of a watershed or a marking point on this operation and the continuation, correct?
As long as it's not a resolution and it's a statement, it's an important statement. It's definitely the international pressure is growing. Yesterday, the EU, almost unnoticed, also had a very similar statement calling for immediate ceasefire. But we can see more and more international actors just calling on Israel to stop the operation, and this is okay, but while Netanyahu is pulled by the other side, calling him to continue the operation, this puts him in the dilemma of what's the next step.
And as you said, he does make his rounds around the Sunday talk shows. Let's take a look at yesterday's.
The Egyptian initiative is the only game in town. And the Egyptian initiative will also enable us to get what I think are the prerequisites for a sustainable period of quiet. And that requires, in essence, the demilitarization of Gaza. That is, we have to demilitarize it from the weapons that Hamas has put in there. Missiles, rockets, terror tunnels. We can't allow them to restock this arsenal, or we'll be stuck in another 5-6 months with the same.
So in any case, the big story of yesterday, it's true that Netanyahu did go and give this Sunday round, but definitely yesterday was a dark day for the Israeli-U.S. relationship. Some looked into the Obama phone call, found a different rhetoric, a bit more tougher rhetoric, but even before that, throughout the whole day, Israeli media and commentators and some Israeli officials have been slamming the U.S. Secretary of State for his failed efforts in the region and his draft proposal that was published in Haaretz yesterday and was circulated in the media. And definitely you could hear from senior U.S. officials they're not happy with the way that the Israeli are conducting this briefing, that these are very insulting remarks. And it's true that there is some kind of shift. But nevertheless, Obama, in his words to Netanyahu yesterday, he did call for an immediate ceasefire, but he did reiterate Israel's right to support itself. But when he talked about disarmament of Gaza, what Netanyahu is expecting to be part of the ceasefire terms, Obama did regard them as something of the long-lasting solution, something to the conflict. So not necessarily something that he thinks has to be in the ceasefire terms.
Right.
And that could be a policy shift between the two allies.
Arad, is disarming Hamas something that is viable or something that the Americans even want to get involved with? I mean, we've seen them a little throw up their hands with, maybe they're sick and tired of this, and maybe completely not wanting to get involved. And disarming Hamas is going to, of course, take an international effort.
Well, if you ask the Israeli population, the answer is clear. Yes, this comes out of the poll that was published last night by Channel 10. And in this regard, I'd like to remind you this old story by the former president, Shimon Peres, who said that polls are something they are like perfume. You can enjoy the scent, but don't drink it.
Right.
So this is applicable to the situation at the moment. Eventually, I think it is possible to get rid of Hamas military capabilities. Israel has the capabilities to do it. The question is on what cost. Quite a senior diplomat that is serving here in Tel Aviv told me the other day that a democratic country cannot get rid of a terror organization like Hamas. It's impossible in democratic means. Maybe Egypt, Sisi's Egypt, can. Israel cannot.
Right. And that's perhaps the international effort will have to come from, led by the Americans.
There will have to be some international effort, some international mechanism that will enable to demilitarize Gaza. if there is such a pretension, unless the pretension is on a short-term ceasefire that will break in 1, 2, 3 years. I don't know.
Well, that really is the question, because Obama's phone call with Netanyahu was his third phone call since the operation, I think, began. And one will say he's just trying to actually just impose now a ceasefire.
I went over this, the readout of this telephone conversation a couple of times since it was published last night. And I seem not to join the Israeli chorus of Netanyahu, or Netanyahu being bashed by Obama, or Obama bashing Netanyahu. I think, we are talking a lot about proportionality. I think that at least the readout was very proportionate. He asked Netanyahu to stop while accepting all the necessary demands, the basic necessary demands of Israel. And now it's time to sit and think of the mechanism. The problem of this war, and don't call it operation and don't call it incursion, it's a war. The problem of this war is that there was no plan. Israel went on this war, it went reluctantly. This is okay, we accept it. Netanyahu was not eager to open this war, but once it opened, there was no political plan or diplomatic plan alongside. No plan, no channels, no discussions, and that's when we have to, now we reached the point when we have to cash the check, and it's a rain check.
Just, Awad said he read out the readout, but at least for the Israeli cabinet, it was definitely, they didn't accept this phone call very fondly. As we mentioned, it happens.
Obama does not work for them.
No,
he's the president of the United States. He's not the president of Israel under Netanyahu.
It just brings out the flames even more, the way the rhetoric, the bad rhetoric in the Israeli right, especially in the Israeli right wing against Obama, against the Obama administration, and this does continue the undermining their special relationship, the way the Israelis treat the Obama administration. It's a total lack of trust.
And that is, of course, reflected perhaps also in the Channel 10 poll with the overwhelming support for the continuing of the operation.
Well,
not trusting the Americans, not trusting...
Just trusting only Israel to be the only one who can defend itself. No one can help us, so we don't need any friends, we don't need any allies.
It can take a week, a day, or a month, and these numbers of the poll, they swap all over.
Yossi?
It's kind of strange to read and see the Israeli reaction to American initiatives. It's like Israel feels that they are doing a great favor to America by accepting the U.S. involvement in negotiations. Sometimes I feel like, wow, United States owes its existence to Israel. Without Israel, United States would fall apart. It's so bizarre. Israel, at least this government, is ungrateful. The U.S. administration is good as far as they finance the Iron Dome, as far as they provide weapons to Israel. When it comes to that aspect of the relations, America is a great ally and a great player in the Middle East and understands the Middle East. When it comes to political solutions, suddenly the Israelis are bashing, or the cabinet ministers are bashing the United States as they don't understand the Middle East. After all, and I talked yesterday to some American officials, they denied flatly that the Kerry plan was a Kerry initiative. They said that the plan, as revealed by Haaretz and leaked by a cabinet minister in Israel.
Okay.
I know who leaked it, but I would not name it here.
Okay.
And it's also it's getting on the nerves of the Americans. I mean, they see that everything that is told confidentially to the Israelis is leaked.
Right.
So the American position is it wasn't a Kerry plan. It was based on previous Israeli understandings and agreements. The lifting the siege or opening the crossings is part of the 2012 ceasefire, which Israel agreed upon in 2012 after the second Gaza war.
But maybe the biggest opposition to the Kerry plan was the fact that it really didn't mention any of the bigger challenges that, as opposed to Pillar of Defense, that is now in protective edge.
We don't really know the Kerry plan.
The Kerry plan. That's the point.
But it was on purpose. If you don't mention the tunnels, it means sorry. here, it means that Israel can continue demolishing the tunnels. If you make a special point of it, then it's a controversial point.
Mm-hmm.
And more than that, I take it from where Yossi finished earlier. I've been talking to some sources within the Turkish entourage in Qatar on Friday, and the Turkish initiative that came out was totally unacceptable. Yes, they acted as the lawyers of Hamas. They represented Hamas. They didn't function as mediators. They didn't mediate. They represented.
Right.
Nevertheless, they came out with an initiative. They came out of Doha when Davutoglu met later with Kerry, which was totally unacceptable. The title of this initiative was ways and means to make sure that Israel cannot attack Hamas or Gaza whenever it wants. This was the framework they were working at. So Kerry did deduct it to something that is can be a starter, as we call a starting point for negotiations. And as Yossi said, we are teaching the Americans how to. We are the only ones in the world that understand Arabic. We are the only ones that understand Turkish. We are the only ones that understand Farsi in Iran. And unfortunately, there are other people that know these languages too.
Quickly, Tal, we want to get an update.
Just a note maybe for the Obama administration, the way Kerry was described yesterday in Israeli media, alien, betrayal, very, very hard adjectives, it was expected. People talked about it even before Kerry arrived to the area. Kerry is a U.S. Secretary of State. His honor is in his place and his respect in his place. But in Israel and the Palestinian Authority, there is a problem with his image. There is a problem with his coercion abilities. And maybe it would be better if there was another U.S. mediator and not Kerry because of
his baggage that he comes with. We're going to start with that right after we get this update from I-24 News reporter Ron Friedman. Ron, you're in Ashkelon. Of course, there was a few rockets there this morning, one landing in an open field.
Right, yeah, good morning. Yeah, so a quiet night here in the south was shattered about an hour ago with a barrage of 3 rockets on the city of Ashkelon. Fortunately, they all landed in open areas, no damage and no injuries. I'm here in Barzilai Medical Center in the city, where currently 33 IDF soldiers that were wounded in the conflict in Gaza are being treated. Most of them are in moderate and light condition. And right behind me, doctors are standing by to receive more wounded, either civilians or soldiers from the conflict. We're hoping that they won't be used and hoping for a quiet day here in Ashkelon.
And of course, the Barzilai Hospital, unfortunately, is also known for not having a safety shelter. During sirens, especially when wounded are being brought in, can you kind of illustrate, of course, the almost very tense picture that comes out when a siren is sounded next to a hospital?
Well, actually, the building here behind me is a specially fortified building that they transferred the trauma unit, the emergency center, into this building at times of emergency like this. So when there's a siren, and we've had that several times here over the last few weeks, people just run into the area behind us there and catch shelter until the all clear is given.
Ron Friedman, our I-24 News reporter there in Ashkelon, thank you for joining us this morning. Tal, I wanted to take off from the statement of Kerry. There's no Middle East mediator that perhaps can come from the United States that is being accepted by both sides. Martin Indyk, of course, comes to mind when his resignation and so forth.
Well, Martin Indyk was also another failed mediator. The U.S., and I do have much respect to the U.S. administration and to the Obama administration, but when you think about who has enough posture to really deal with the situation, in the past, Yossi and Rad can probably say better, but an American official comes to the region to impose a ceasefire. When Hillary Clinton came here in November 2012, it was clear that when she came to the region, it would be over in a few days. He doesn't have enough standing, in my point of view, and his reputation is been diminished by the Israeli, at least by the Israeli cabinet. They speak about him in ways that you don't expect anyone to speak about the closest ally, and I think that this could be a point, maybe a different American figure. Maybe I'm right. Maybe no American figure.
I think it's more complicated than that. You cannot compare the geopolitics of Hillary Clinton's time to the geopolitics of today. Now,
also the persona. Maybe it does have to do with
it's not. Well, maybe it is the persona, but I think it's much more than the persona. The whole circumstances have changed. There are no channels and leverages for the United States of America to function here. Egypt has changed. Egypt would not talk to Hamas. When Hillary Clinton was here, it was Morsi who was in power, and Morsi was accepted both by the United States and both by Hamas. Now Sisi is not accepted nor by, well, he does not want to accept Hamas, and the United States does not want to accept him. And suddenly they need Sisi to speak to Hamas, so something is wrong here. Then the Turkish side, there's a black cat that passed between Erdogan and Obama. Erdogan was just disclosing that he does not speak to Obama, he doesn't respect him anymore, and suddenly it's the Turkish channel that the United States reluctantly has to use in order to get some messages to and from Hamas.
And there's a lot of foreign policy that has changed from the United States' standpoint since November 2012 until now. We can talk about Syria, we can talk about, of course, ISIS and so forth. The foreign policy has also changed.
The whole situation has changed, but the biggest drawback is that there are no channels and no leverages.
Yes.
Well, you see, first you kill the messenger. That's what Israel did to carry and all the U.S. envoys, and then you say there are no messengers, so we don't get communication. I don't think it's a matter of the messenger. Of course, a good envoy could influence the development and negotiations, but only in the margins. If there is a will, you will have an agreement. If the two sides don't want to have an agreement, then you won't have an agreement. And in the third Gaza war, the Israeli position has changed. The stated goal of Israel was, after Israel showed the great restraint, no doubt about it, Israeli position and stated goal was to destroy the tunnels. The tunnels have been destroyed practically, more or less, and Israel can now pull out. Suddenly, Israel is having a bigger, bigger demands. They want to get rid of Hamas rocket arsenal. They want to demilitarize the Gaza Strip. All these demands have to be put on the table and to be negotiated. And after all, Israel can get back to Gaza, can reignite its offensive whenever it wants. So I don't think it's doable. One more remark on the military front. Yesterday was a significant day. First of all, the number of rockets fired at Israel was the lowest since the beginning of the war. 56 rockets have been fired. Secondly, if I'm not mistaken, Israeli soldiers, even one single Israeli soldier was not killed yesterday. That's another important and good development. And on the bad side, we are entering day 21 of the war. It's going to be Israel's longest war.
Operation Cast Lead.
Well, it was 21 days.
Right.
And we are not yet there. We are not at the ceasefire. Now, the Yom Kippur War, in which was the most traumatizing war in Israel, 2,700 Israeli soldiers were killed, lasted 22 days. And this is going to be, tomorrow it will equal the the Yom Kippur War, the October 73 war, and it will be Israel's longest war.
And perhaps longest war, and also without not a clear-cut conviction of what was achieved and what needs also to be achieved, and of course how to long-term strategy to prevent it from happening again.
Yes, that's true. But on one hand, I think it was excellent. It was very clever that the government, the cabinet, did not stage great, grandiose goals. It was a limited goal because Israel knew that A, they don't want to topple the Hamas regime. B, they don't want to enter the urban areas, the densely populated areas of Gaza, and indeed we did not enter them.
Right.
And thirdly, we know that you cannot defeat a terrorist organization, as it was said here.
Tal, of course, when you look at Obama's statements and you hear what Yossi said, you can't defeat a terrorist organization, what is the best optimal outcome for, in the U.S.'s eyes, to happen? Is it an immediate ceasefire now and we'll talk later, or do they have a long-term plan instead?
Well, the U.S. is definitely pushing to create some kind of situation that would, in the end, renew talks between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But Israel is not yet at that point to accept that. That is actually, in my point of view, an inevitable outcome of this whole conflict, and maybe the only positive outcome we can think about this whole conflict. But the Israeli cabinet is still not there. It still hasn't decided yet. It's still denouncing basically the Palestinian unity government. It's still not backing the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas enough. And at the meantime, they seem like they're more interested in Kerry bashing than in really doing anything positive and going in that point of view. But yes, definitely the U.S. and the EU, by the way. Last week when the EU published their call for disarmament, everyone in Israel was looking at the headline that how the EU is calling for disarmament of Gaza, but in the end of that document was an imperative of a plan for renewing peace talks, and there were all of the outlines of a peace talk and a peace negotiations, also including, by the way, disarmament of Gaza. So if Israel wants to go to disarmament of Gaza, what the international community is basically saying, okay, but it has to be part of a long-lasting solution to the conflict. And that is what Obama said yesterday to Netanyahu in the phone call.
Meaning it's a two-way road, you know,
Right.
there's only one direction. And coming back to the numbers of rockets being launched towards Israel recently, the diminishing numbers, well, we don't really know if it's the big success of the Israeli operation, or the other side keeping its pile of rockets for days to come, preparing for, you know, the stock to last for further days of combat.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more from, of course, Operation Protective Edge, Day 21. Just to remind us all, this morning a rocket did fall in Ashkelon. No casualties were reported. It fell in an open area in the coastal city. This was after a relatively quiet night. And the UN Security Council is meeting at this time. I believe they've just finished meeting, voting on a statement which calls for an immediate ceasefire. And we will be starting with the Israeli ambassador to the UN when we're back and hear what he had to say at the meeting. We'll be right back after the short break. Welcome back to I-24 News Morning Edition. Of course, this is a special broadcast this morning, Day 21 of Operation Protective Edge. Just now, the Israeli ambassador to the UN in New York, Ron Prosor, spoke to reporters, had a press conference after the UN Security Council met to vote on a statement that had been previously drafted. Let's take a look.
Imagine what your life would be if you lived with these threats over 10 years. The equation is simple, and I said it and I'll repeat it again. If it's going to be quiet in Israel, it's going to be quiet in Gaza. It's as simple as it gets. I call upon each and every one of you to stand with Israel. Standing with a nation that fights terrorism and defends its citizens is the same way that you would expect your government to defend you. Stand with good against evil and stand for right over wrong.
And, you know, when you hear the statements made by the UN ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, it's the same talking points that we've heard. Maybe we could say this is cast lead even. They're not, the talking points haven't changed. Tal?
The talking points haven't changed, and just maybe one good point for the Israeli communications team, they have succeeded to convey a unified message, and it's all of the representatives in most of the international interviews and most of international statements, this talking point about what would you do if your country was targeted by tunnels and terrorists, and sometimes even taking it too far. Yesterday there was a small incident with the Israeli embassy in Dublin that was tweeting too much visuals regarding this claim. But yes, definitely, this is the main Israeli claim to the international community, and it works, that Israel has to defend itself. Last week, the British foreign minister was here, so Netanyahu and Lieberman both were comparing it to the Blitz of the Second World War. This is the main Israeli talking point. A bit carried away, quoting Churchill. Yeah, but
we'll start with that right when we just need to get a quick update now from our I-24 news reporter Charles Biebelzer. Charles, you're on the Israeli-Gaza border this morning.
Good morning, Yael. Yes, as you know, the Israeli government has essentially reverted back to a policy of quiet will be met with quiet. And overnight, you received just that. There were no rockets fired at Israel between midnight and 8 a.m. today. And in response, the IDF refrained from taking any airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, although there is still operational activity on the ground, primarily targeting the tunnels that Hamas have built. However, approximately 45 minutes ago, a lone rocket was indeed fired at Ashkelon. It landed in an open field, and in response, about 15 minutes ago, we can tell you that there was Israeli shelling into Gaza. We heard about 5 or 6 explosions, and it lasted for about 5 minutes. So obviously the flip side to quiet will be met with quiet is that attacks will be met with a response. And that's probably what you saw there. That being said, overall, there is a kind of ceasefire, an unofficial ceasefire that's been adopted by both sides in anticipation of the Muslim holiday and in respect, really, for the beginning of the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr. So today, this morning, may have been the exception of the rule, and you should see a relatively calm day throughout.
Charles Biebelzer, I-24 news correspondent there on the Gaza border. Thank you for that update. Taking it back into the question of what works and what doesn't work in terms of talking points, Elad, you say comparing it to World War II, which is something that Netanyahu has not only used when the UK foreign minister is here, but he has used it, I think, also in Sunday talk shows quite a bit, comparing it to the World War II and so forth. Doesn't work?
I think that's the biggest compliment Hamas could have got. You know, that's comparing him to Nazi Germany with all the might, etc. You know, this puts Israel in a very awkward position. Coming back to the story of the Ben Gurion airport, the flights coming in and out. So, you know, this was a two-way sword. On the one hand, we claim that everything is safe and flights can come in, but on the other hand, we are trying to show how much we suffer from these barrage of rockets. Now, don't misunderstand me. The fact that Israel is being hit once and again by a rocket from Gaza is totally unacceptable. And this is why the biggest threat to the so-called success of this war is if we will get into a continuous ceasefire with no agreement aligned to it. There has to be agreement, and there has to be a long-term agreement, and it has to be a long-term agreement with Hamas. I don't care how, I don't care in what means, but this has to be the outcome of this bloodshed, of this devastation. Otherwise, it would be in total vain. I've been suggesting from a few days ago already, I suggested that there shouldn't be recognition of Hamas, and Hamas does not have to recognize Israel. There have to be mutual, there can be or there could be mutual acceptance. And after this acceptance, they have to proceed into a long-term hudna, a long-term ceasefire, not of a year, not of 2 years. They should aim at a extreme long-term, 10 years, 20 years, I know that Hamas is willing to discuss it, and it's about time that Israel, from a point of strength, will accept this too.
Yossi, but is that viable, and I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, to go into a hudna or a long-term ceasefire with Hamas when we know of other groups that are acting in the Gaza Strip, smaller groups, maybe even more dangerous groups? Yesterday we spoke about the Pentagon official that said don't try to disarm Hamas because there's going to be someone else will take its place.
Well, there are in Gaza around 17 small groups on top of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, which are the two largest and are in accordance with each other. These are pro-Al-Qaeda organizations. There is a small group following the ISIS in Iraq. There are some little militias, family-based, mafia-based, criminal-based, terrorist-based organizations, and it's a problem there. But if Hamas really wants to impose its authority on them, they can do it. Maybe not 100%, but I would say to 95–99% they can impose their authority because Hamas is powerful enough, and Hamas authority is more or less recognized by these small renegade organizations. So therefore, I think mutual acceptance or a readiness for a long-term solution between Israel and Hamas is viable, is doable. I don't know if it can last 10 years, but I think most Israelis, including those who are at the receiving end, those who are living in the south of Israel, would settle for 5 years. It would be sufficient if we have a 5-year period of calm and quiet and tranquility, returning to the south. We shouldn't forget the south, the Israeli south, is being at the receiving end, has been suffered for nearly 14 years.
Right.
The first rocket launch from Gaza was in 2001. Already the first small range, short range rockets. So 5 years agreement is sufficient for Israel. The question is what Israel is ready to give in return. If you want an agreement, you need to compromise.
And so if, Tal, if I take Arad's assumption that Hamas will be willing to negotiate a long-term agreement, and Yossi's assumption that Hamas can handle the other groups that will be maybe the copycat groups within, will it fly by the Israeli political establishment?
I don't think so. I think it's a dream. I think for the past 7 years, the Israeli political establishment has decided to isolate Hamas. In my personal view, this has been a failed strategy, and maybe a different strategy would move Hamas from being more from the terrorist part to more to the political front. So a process that is coming and comes and goes. But in any case, I don't think that Netanyahu, not this current government, has enough guts to even bring up the words of treating Hamas as an equal player. This is totally... Netanyahu treats Hamas as a terrorist group, not as someone you should discuss, not as a legitimate ruler of Gaza, but on the other hand, the Netanyahu government will have to come to terms with giving President Abbas more authorities in the Gaza Strip, and trying to maybe...
The point is that if the Netanyahu government will give Abbas more authority in the Gaza Strip, I mean, this has nothing to do with reality, because Abbas does not have any leverage in Gaza. So I wonder what would be an acceptable political solution to this government, if there is any.
Well, I'm not sure there is an acceptable political solution for this government. Since the beginning, this is a two-voiced government that doesn't have a clear policy on anything, and is just being dragged into all kinds of diplomatic situations. But also, we've been talking about this for the past few days. This could be the beginning of the end of Netanyahu's government. What has happened in this operation politically is that Netanyahu has been bypassed by the right, not from one, not from two, from at least three contenders. Each of them is just waiting to gain the political gain they can make out of pointing at Netanyahu's misconduct in this whole operation. The minute it is over, it'll start to fly, and I predict that at some point this will have an impact on Netanyahu's coalition this way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if, this is just an assumption that I throw on the table, and I wonder what you would all think about it. And if Netanyahu would come out with a long-term agreement vis-a-vis Hamas, not with Hamas, but with some means that will be accepted with Hamas, he will obviously get the support of the Israeli opposition in the Knesset. So is this viable? Is such a scenario viable for him to align more to the center, not to say the left, rather than stick with the extreme right in his government at the moment?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I don't think Netanyahu has the courage to cross the Rubicon in that kind of way. I don't think Netanyahu has the courage to totally leave his political base. He's very deep inside of him, but I don't think he would go to that direction.
So he's in a lose-lose situation
Definitely.
now after he's been receiving so many compliments for managing the military crisis.
Let me just put in another factor here. The opposition up until now has been quite supportive. I mean, you don't really hear any kind of opposition to the Netanyahu policy up until now. They say we're supporting what's right and what should be done just in terms of justice.
I think that the Labour is calling for a political plan, for a diplomatic plan, which we lack.
But not something that's going to unseat or unthrone the Netanyahu government, but perhaps even putting Netanyahu closer to them.
But traditionally in war, that's not, when Israel is in war, the opposition would not go that far to threaten Netanyahu. If Netanyahu has any threat, it's not from the opposition, it's from his own coalition members at the moment.
From the home opposition.
Exactly.
With me now on the telephone line is Igal Palmor, the Foreign Ministry here in Israel spokesperson. Igal, thank you for joining us.
Sure, good morning.
We're, of course, speaking about, we started off with the UN Security Council statement this morning. Nothing that probably surprises anyone in the Foreign Ministry this morning. It is something that was agreed upon in the past, and of course, everyone was going to look on it for what would exactly been said. Any statements made there by other representatives or ambassadors that surprised you this morning?
No, not really. Allow me to say that nothing will surprise us anymore from the UN. The UN has been for too many years a bubble, living disconnected from the real world. And so, once you get acquainted with the strange ways in which this bubble conducts its affairs, you're not surprised by anything. Be that as it may, the UN is calling for a ceasefire. We have already implemented a ceasefire. We've been holding our fire since last night. And we hope that this time it will hold and that Hamas will not breach it. As far as we are concerned, we are looking to an unlimited truce at this point.
And what did you, ahead of the proposed, of course, vote this evening on the statement, direct the the Israeli ambassador to the UN to speak differently, to try different tactic, quote unquote, in order to combat the vote that would, of course, condemn Israel and call for a ceasefire immediately?
Look, we are, of course, employing various diplomatic tactics, both in New York and in relevant capitals. This is what diplomats are paid to do, and this is what they are doing. So considering the circumstances and the real conditions of the playground, so to speak, the UN, I think that this resolution is not all that bad. Again, comparing it with previous resolutions and with what could have been, I think that the major thing here is a call for ceasefire, no conditions imposed on Israel, and that's the most important thing, because we also believe that in order to reach a long-term ceasefire, the only viable plan is the Egyptian plan, and we call on the international community to provide its full and unreserved support to the Egyptian initiative.
Igal, we have a question here from our I-24 News diplomatic correspondent, Tal Shalev.
Good morning, Igal. I'd like to know, we've seen in the past few days continuing demonstrations against Israel in European capitals and all around the world. How much is this taken into consideration in the political level in reaching a ceasefire, this effect on the Israeli status and image in the world?
Look, it's a very worrying situation in certain countries, and you know exactly what countries I'm talking about. These demonstrations are not just political manifestation of disagreement or criticism of Israel. In some cases, they have degenerated into violence and vandalism of Jewish businesses and synagogues. In many cases, they turned into blatant anti-Semitic marches. So it is very worrying, but we believe that this should not be connected to the military situation on the ground. The Operation Protective Edge has specific goals of its own to reduce and to silence rocket fire, to destroy tunnels, and on the long term to demilitarize Gaza. Now, yes, there will be a price in terms of image, and there will be a price in terms of demonstrations and protests. That is something that is taken into account, but it's not I would say, a very weighty argument in favor of this or that military step.
And Yigal, of course, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was in the region, and the ceasefire plan that he promoted was published yesterday to much criticism, I think, over the entire spectrum of the Israeli political establishment and also the Israeli media. Also, we heard criticism from the Palestinian Authority. How will that affect, in the long run, any kind of U.S.-Israeli relations, or is this just a mere bump in the road?
I think it's too early to say how it will affect our relations with the Palestinians and with the Americans on the long run. It certainly is a bump, but let's not forget that the United States has been, is, and remains Israel's strongest and most friendly and most credible ally. We will still need the United States as our ally, not just at the UN, but in any international arena, and confronting any kind of diplomatic or military enemy. They are there for us. They are our friends. And regardless of certain bumps, we will, I'm calling on everyone not to lose sight of this reality.
And thus, I'm going to follow up on that question. And perhaps in lack of a quote-unquote honest broker, is the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs looking at other brokers or other potential brokers for this conflict?
Well, I know that pundits love to try and look at alternatives, but in real life, there are no other brokers. The only broker that has ever achieved anything in terms of diplomatic agreements in this region has been the United States. And no other country can can take its place. I mean, take a look around you and try to name one country or one organization that could wield the influence and that could actually, that even shows the will to involve itself to the level that is required in order to guarantee some kind of peace deal or some kind of arrangement between Israel and the Palestinians.
Yigal Palmor, the spokesperson for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Tal, you wanted to comment?
Just to note that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not, the diplomats are doing the work, the diplomatic work all around the globe, but definitely the Israeli Foreign Minister, Avigdor Lieberman, is not a substantial part of this operation,
and
not from the diplomatic front. Netanyahu has pushed him away after his ongoing criticism. And if we look at, compared to Operation Cast Lead, not Cast Lead, excuse me, Pillar of Defense, Lieberman was there, part of the Troika running the war. This time, Lieberman is not there. Lieberman has been pushed out. He's sitting in the cabinet meetings. He comes not to all of them. He doesn't even show up to all of them. But he's definitely not in the front of deciding who would be the best broker, who would not be the best broker. He was supposed to leave.
He's leaving that to Netanyahu and the defense minister?
He's not leaving. He's just not giving a chance. He's not giving a chance to even be involved in it. Netanyahu is conducting this by himself and by a team of experts that are under both from the defense ministry and the prime minister's office. The foreign ministry is almost not uninvolved.
And nor does Lieberman, as foreign minister, work on a diplomatic shield or any kind of a diplomatic iron dome that will enable the Israeli government to carry on or to find any kind of solution. He's working on other stuff, mainly on internal politics at the moment.
Well, that I don't agree a bit, because I think at the beginning of the war he did take many foreign ministers on trips to the south, which had their impact.
He did not have a choice. I mean, they came to see Netanyahu, and they had to meet with him too, and take these conducted tours. But I mean, he's not initiating anything. He's not traveling anywhere. He's not being invited anywhere. Mm-hmm. You know, this meeting on Saturday in Paris was initially planned to be the final picture of this conflict, right, and not the conflict of this war, of this current episode. Right. And well, apparently it didn't came up to this, but Lieberman was not even invited. Can you imagine Tzipi Livni being the foreign minister, or dare I say, Shimon Peres being the foreign minister? Where would he have been in these times? He would have been traveling all around trying to connect the dots and getting somewhere. Lieberman is sitting in the best case scenario in the studios, right, and bashing the government and inflaming the flames.
And thinking, of course, of the political campaign right after this ceasefire takes place. Yes.
Well, today, 100 years ago, started the First World War. So let's put our war in perspective. And what I think the lesson, if there is any lesson of that war 100 years ago, is that it evolved eventually into a static war, into a war of attrition, trenches, useless killing of each other, in many fronts, and I think the IDF, the Israeli cabinet, has reached a junction in which it has to make a decision whether to end this war, because otherwise it would turn into a war of attrition, or the other alternative, which no one wants to embrace, is to invade Gaza, to occupy Gaza and get rid of Hamas. So just sitting there for another day, another week, another 2 weeks, it's useless.
Eventually the disaster will come.
And eventually the more you drag in, the more risks you are exposed to. I think the cabinet knows it. That's why it debated last night for nearly 8 hours what to do next. I don't know if they made already a decision. Probably Prime Minister Netanyahu has a plan as an exit policy. I believe he doesn't want to get deeper into Gaza and fearing that things would get out of control, out of hand.
I wouldn't give too much importance to the length of the deliberations in the cabinet. Netanyahu has this tendency to let his ministers talk. Right. They can talk as much as they can, and they said, everything is on the record, so he's covered, and then he only decides. I'm being told that when there are 3 hours cabinet meeting, this is an extremely short meeting, so the length of the deliberation is not a factor. No.
I-24 News correspondent Charles Biebles, you are on the Israeli-Gaza border this morning. What's the latest?
Hi, El. We spoke not very long ago, and I told you that obviously a rocket was launched from Gaza into Ashkelon earlier today, and then I told you that we heard Israeli shelling in response. I can confirm to you now that the IDF has confirmed that it did respond to that rocket fire by targeting the site from which it emanated from in Beit Lahia. So I just wanted to say that this is really the first opportunity since the government adopted a policy of quiet for quiet, and it shows that the IDF still does remain prepared to respond from any attacks emanating from Gaza. So essentially what this means is that the ball really has been shifted into Hamas's court, and over the next 24 hours, really, it will dictate the nature of the conflict.
Charles Biebles, thank you for that update. You, of course, will be updating us throughout the morning. Tal, you did ask Igal Pomor, of course, what the outside external protests have been, if at all, impacting the Israeli government's decision. And I want to also ask you, Arad, as the foreign affairs editor, these protests that we've been seeing, much will be said, okay, every campaign there are these kinds of protests in the streets of Europe, but this time it's perhaps unprecedented in its fine line between anti-Israel and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and it's twofold because of the phenomenon that you have just mentioned, and it is really, I wouldn't say it's unprecedented, but it's more extreme. You know, it's this phenomenon is building up. Because of that, we saw measures being taken in France by the government to try and avoid these kind of demonstrations. And what's more stunning, the media in Germany started an anti-Semitism campaign. You know, the Bild Zeitung, which is one of the most populist media outlets in the world, not to say Germany, you know, on its front page stated no to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism will not rise again, because of and other newspapers in Germany as well. So this is causing two currents, this phenomenon. And again, you know, when we are talking about Israel being attacked, and on the other side, people see the devastation and the rubble piling up in Gaza, it's extremely difficult to explain and to bring forward the point that Israel is the just side of this conflict.
Tal, is it impacting the Israeli government in any way, would you say, in its decision-making, the pictures from Paris and London?
I think the fact that there is an ongoing undermining of the Israeli image in the international community is definitely something that is in their mind, especially in the foreign ministry, among the diplomats. I'm not sure inside the political level, but as Yigal said earlier, the foreign ministry is definitely aware of it. And it's not only, it's true that it's a lot of anti-Semitism, but there is some things that Israeli policy can do differently to minimize this effect.
Right. Thank you all for joining me this morning. We're going to take a short break for the I-24 News Desk for the main morning headlines, and we'll be back with more Morning Edition, of course, a special broadcast this morning. Good morning, and thank you for staying with us here at I-24 News Morning Edition. Of course, this is a special broadcast this morning. Today marks the 21st day of Operation Protective Edge. The UN has just met to formally vote on a statement which calls for, quote, an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire in the Gaza war between Israel and Hamas. They scheduled a meeting at midnight New York time to adopt it. The statement also called on all parties to, quote, engage in efforts to achieve a durable and fully respected ceasefire based on the Egyptian initiative. Last night, the U.S. President Barack Obama called Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to urge also for an immediate ceasefire. This, of course, is after the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry flew home amid both Israeli and Palestinian Authority criticism of his handling of the crisis. Meanwhile, the past few hours were quiet, but in the early hours of this morning, 3 rockets were fired into Israel, one landing in the coastal city of Ashkelon in an open field. No casualties or injuries were reported. There have also been not many Israeli strikes on the Gaza Strip in the past 12 hours. The IDF death toll, of course, stands at 43, and the Gaza Health Ministry says 15 Palestinians were killed by IDF fire on Saturday, bringing the dead to 1,034 who have been killed since the beginning of the operation, and 6,233 which were wounded. With me for this hour is Brian Thomas, the Israeli Coolie blogger. Israeli Coolie, am I pronouncing that right?
Israeli Cool.
Israeli Cool. I added the Coolie in to make it
even cooler.
Even cooler, there you go. And of course, Colonel Richard Kemp, the former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. Thank you for joining us. And of course, Chen Kleinman, thank you for being with us this morning. The Israel Fire and Rescue Services and the EVP Director of Operations. We'll start with you in just a moment. First, Brian, of course, being a blogger at this time, you have a double hat to fill. You have, of course, your blog that you need to update maybe, I don't know, hourly or daily, but also when in times of war, people are going to look at what you're saying maybe more than what they're looking at the media, more than what I'm saying.
Sure, we are much busier. It's a group blog, so it was founded by an Australian, and he came up with this Israeli Cool name. But we have a team of people. We have some Arabic speakers, and we update a lot. But right now we've been doing some detailed analysis of the names and ages put out by Al Jazeera of people unfortunately killed in Gaza, and we're doing a kind of analysis that it seems that the mainstream media just doesn't want to do, and our blog is very busy with people coming to see that.
Let's take it back a few. The motive for putting up an Israeli cool blog was not obviously in terms of the conflict. It was something completely different. And of course, the reality strikes here, and you have to kind of adjust your motives, right?
You know, the blog has been always, it swings around from light-hearted and news about celebrities who visit and who likes Israel, who doesn't. We try to keep it very light most of the time, but then we write serious articles when we need to. And obviously when a war strikes, we have both the serious analysis, but also, last night Hamas were putting out pictures of an F-16 that they apparently have shot down. Of course they haven't. It's a plane from 2006 that everybody knows had a blown tire on takeoff. It's a very famous case. Hamas put this out as propaganda, and their people lap it up. And the same people putting out that F-16 that we make a joke about are the same people writing the casualty reports that the BBC and CNN and Fox and all the media just take uncritically. The numbers that you just read, you have no way to independently verify them.
Right. I'm going to save my face here. I attribute it to the Gaza Health Ministry. But
exactly. That's Hamas.
But perhaps that is a challenge that not only facing is international media, but it's also international governments. How is Israel, Foreign Affairs Ministry and so forth, able to deal with all these different fronts that you're putting up? Yes, every single picture they're going to have to go and verify?
Well, they don't, and it's a good thing that there is an army of bloggers like us who take every photo that's tweeted. You know, when supporters of Hamas on Twitter put out the picture of the Fogels, it beggars belief that they can take a picture of a slaughtered Jewish family and put that out and say, look, the Jews are killing Arabs. It happens, and it happens all the time. And the same people who do that then tell us 800, 1,000, 2,000 people have been killed, and best yet, 80% are civilians. Where did that number come from? How do we know?
You tweeted here, we can see that one of your tweets. Who did you give the rockets to when you found them? Did you get an answer to that question?
Never. Well, actually, I tweeted that minutes after UNRWA first owned up to the first school having rockets in it. No answer. Then they found more rockets in another school, and finally it was admitted that the rockets were passed to the Gaza authorities, which turns out to be Hamas. So UNRWA are not only storing terrorist rockets, when asked, they politely give them back to the terrorists.
And this operation, maybe compared to others, has been completely maybe also parallel in the social media, the way it is on the ground, more than ever, more than Castlet and so forth. But some will say, yes, it's taking place, it's waging in the internet, but it's waging within all, like the Israel supporters will speak with the Israel supporters, and the Palestinian supporters will speak with the Palestinian supporters, and there's not much impact on either side. Do you see that your tweets and your maybe uncovering of the truth and so forth are reaching the other side as well?
There's two ways to look at it. You know, there are sides. There are the massively pro-Hamas people. There's nothing going to touch them. Nothing is going to touch them except, you know, bombs, basically. Nothing's going to change their mind. They are sitting in Gaza, some of them. They are watching terrorists launch rockets from next to them, and this includes the world's press, and they don't mention it. So you can't touch them. And the pro-Israel side, that's great. It's nice to have a choir. But every now and then stuff trickles out. You know, our work on just pointing out that there are problems when 50% of the population of Gaza are women, but way less than 50% of the casualties are women. Just that alone, that does creep into the wider consciousness. And I think, you know, there have been cartoons in London showing Hamas terrorists in a hospital shooting out the window. Now, for the London Times to print a cartoon like that, who is normally their cartoons are not very favourable, it means that the word has got out that Hamas are really hiding behind all the civilians.
What would you say the biggest challenge then is, as you see it now? Is it convincing the other side that are already maybe convinced? Is it working with the Israeli side, who perhaps are putting a lot of effort in the diplomatic level and not on the social media level?
You know, Israel's improved. Look, the IDF spokesperson, I think, has done a tremendous job this time. They're getting stuff out very quickly, and that helps us. You know, when they put out videos a few hours after they occur, that's wonderful. Not everybody will believe them. The usual crew will say that they're propaganda, but I think the vast majority of the people who are not deeply involved in this are starting to get a message that this was a problem we had to deal with, and there was no way left to do it other than what we're doing.
Brian Thomas, thank you. We're going to get a quick update now from our I-24 news correspondent, Ron Friedman. Ron, you are in Ashkelon this morning, standing by the Barzilai Hospital.
Hi, yes, here in Ashkelon, things are quiet now. Earlier this morning, around 7:15, we heard sirens, and we know that at least one rocket fell in an open area around the city. Nobody was injured, no property was damaged. No group has officially taken responsibility for that rocket fire yet, but we do know, we have heard reports that the IDF has retaliated with artillery fire towards the source of rockets. Here in Ashkelon, at the Barzilai Hospital, we currently have 35 soldiers that were wounded in the Gaza conflict. Of them, majority, 29 of them are in really light condition. 7 remaining ones are in moderate condition.
And of course, Ron, we spoke earlier this morning about the lack of a safe shelter in the Barzilai Hospital, something that has been, of course, tormenting, I would say, the Israeli government since previous operations. Will this operation, do you think, change the situation there at the Barzilai Hospital? Even this morning, what was done during the siren?
Well, during the sirens here, people rushed for cover, the closest they can find. Behind us, there's some construction there. People can find shelter there. And inside the passageway, if you turn left, that's where the doctors, that's the receiving bay, that's where the doctors and medical staff receive patients that are brought in. It is a protected area, so that's where people rush for cover. But the whole issue of fortification here in Barzilai has been a long-standing saga, you know, at least since 2009, Operation Cast Lead. But even before that, I mean, rockets have been falling on Ashkelon for at least 10 years. And there's been back and forth. There's issues of budget. There's issue of building licenses. Hopefully, this round will end with a diminished capability to fire rockets on Ashkelon, and at the same time, hopefully the government will take action to add better protection here.
Ron Friedman, our I-24 news correspondent there in Ashkelon. Thank you for that update. With me now also in studio is Adi Zahevi. He is of the EVP director. EVP standing for, Adi?
The Emergency Volunteers Project.
A little bit about it, because of course at this time we have so many different NGOs and so forth helping. This is a different NGO. It's trying to actually help security forces and not actually only civilian efforts on the ground.
Correct. More to the emergency forces in Israel. The EVP was established a few years ago by emergency personnel from the State of Israel, and collaborated with emergency personnel mainly from the United States, with the idea that in times of crisis we'll need more help, more support, manpower support. And we thought that to train people to know the system in Israel, the protocols, the equipment, the procedures, basically would give us the ability to answer this problem.
And when you do this as a volunteer work, how can it be something that's long-sustaining? Is it only something that happens when there's conflict, and then you can, obviously it's easier to get volunteers on board? Or is there something that is a long-term kind of plan in place that people say, we want to be here for the long run?
Well, I would say that it's more like a partnership. We train every year in the United States mainly, and also in Israel, teams of volunteers. We maintain the bridge and the connection with them every year, and we know that we will not have emergencies every year or second year, so it's important that they will know that they can volunteer in Israel and they can support and help during the year, not just in times of crisis.
Right. And what is the main line of support that they're giving in this specific operation in Protective Edge? It is similar to the previous operations that we've seen here in Israel in terms of the home front, but it is different in the sense that there are much more rockets coming in, and of course civilian lives are being affected not only in the south but also in the center and north of the country.
Yeah, the main idea here is for us because most of our firefighters are also served in the army. So the number of firefighters doing their job actually is going down. So the main idea is to bring people from the state or people to help us, and those volunteers are actually working side by side with the Israeli firefighters. They know exactly what to do. We train them. And again, the bonding and the cooperation helps us actually to function.
So what is the actual position in the field? Now, of course, in the past 21 days, what has been the focus of EVP and of the Israel Fire Services in general?
The focus is because of the fire services needs to work like usual. Those guys, those firefighters coming from the state are working with us side by side. It's part of our team.
No matter what's happening.
No matter what. They've been in the Gaza Strip, not inside, of course, in the border. They helped us to move our firefighters to other places we needed them more. And it was amazing. The help was horrific.
When you have American volunteers like this, obviously there are people that they've seen things that you haven't seen, and they're seeing, and you're seeing things when you go over there probably that you're not used to. Are they surprised by anything here on the home front? Does anything, strike them out of the ordinary? Obviously, it's not a normal situation when rockets are being fired into civilian populations.
So yes, the answer is definitely yes. Although we try to prepare them as much as we can for the sites and the calls that they're going to see and get, but after all, they come from a different country. So it takes them a bit, a few seconds, a few hours to understand, but they are professional firefighters, and they can handle it. It's amazing. It's amazing. They actually wanted to respond to every call. They wanted to be the first on the scene, and this is the brotherhood of firefighters. But the good, I think that this is also help people that wants to respond to Israel, to help Israel. That gives them an answer, because EVP is not just firefighters or rescue personnel. EVP is also community volunteers, social workers, etc. People that actually want to be with their boots on the ground. People that wants to do more than just sit at home and say, what can we do from here? So EVP gives them actually a chance to actually go and help in Israel.
Has there been any story that particularly touched one of the firefighters, something that, as we said, they aren't used to, this situation that sadly many of us in Israel are used to, of dealing with civilian populations in danger? Is there anything that they especially said, wow, I cannot believe this is happening right now, and I'm here on the ground to help? Anything in particular that you remember from the last?
Listen, as emergency personnel usually can do the switch, and this is what we do. We do the switch. When we are in an emergency situation, this is what we do. We don't think, we act.
Right.
So I would definitely say that after they can, we talk between ourselves and we understand, and we basically brainstorm about different things. But I can tell you that one of the things that impressed all of us here in Israel. One of the soldiers that fell in Gaza was the son of an Israeli officer firefighter. And all the group decided that they would like to go to the funeral with the Israeli firefighters, because they said, we are brothers, we are family, we're here to be with you, and they really want to share their love and their care for the families, and they actually went to the funeral. And I think this is the main thing. This is the heart, the passion to help Israel in times of need. This is a great example that shows that.
Colonel Kemp, of course, when looking at the specific Israeli situation on the home front, it's quite maybe unique on the world stage in terms of security, how to keep the civilians safe. How important are these, can we say volunteering organizations to the military establishment, to the home front command? Is it necessary, meaning is the military establishment not able to cover it all, and thus they do need volunteers from around the world?
Well, I think the more help that the authorities here on the home front can get, clearly the better, because I think particularly if they can count on those resources,
right,
because it enables them to put more resources at the front. And we've heard just now about how some firefighters have been called up to the army, and therefore it's leaving, maybe leaving fewer firefighters here in Israel, and in a situation where it could quite easily get even more combustible than it's become already. So yes, I think it's extremely important.
Is the government working with you hand in hand in this?
And that's something I wanted to add. I think EVP is different from other NGOs because we basically working with the government side by side. We train the volunteers to be focused and aimed to what they need to know in order to actually help in times of crisis and not interfere. And when we deploy or we activate is hand by hand with the Israeli government. And I think that's very, very important. We had many cases that we actually put on standby volunteers, and they really wanted to come, and we said, no, at the end we don't need you guys, because the important thing is to help, not to interfere.
Has the Israeli government said that they do need more volunteers? That's the opposite, vice versa?
Well,
has it called for more volunteers because of a lack of resources?
No, in this case, I think that the brothers in the United States really wanted to help because they were trained for this kind of a mission, and we decided that we really wanna activate and help the firefighters in Israel, because it's very important to show the standing together, the bond between the two.
I think in some ways it's comparable, I would guess, to the number of overseas volunteers that come to fight with the IDF. And we saw only a few days ago 2 American lone soldiers, volunteers, didn't need to come here, came here, put themselves in harm's way, and tragically were killed. But of course there are many more. I was down in the Gaza border area yesterday and talking to one lad from France and another one from North London who they're in the IDF, they're Israeli soldiers, but they've come over here to help the effort. And it's been a kind of spirit and a movement that's been going on since even before, but certainly since 1948, when large numbers of volunteers came to fight in the War of Independence.
Anything that can be compared to in the British forces? Are there such volunteers?
We on the whole, most of the British forces are from the United Kingdom, but we have a surprising number of soldiers serving with us from the Commonwealth countries, such as New Zealand, Australia, Canada, South Africa. Very large number. It's a similar kind of thing, except it's not, on the whole, in this current era, Britain doesn't see itself anyway as being under immediate siege and threat in the same way as Israel is.
It's not fighting wars on its land, of course.
Well, precisely that. And so the motivation is a bit different, but the kind of principle and the brotherhood, I think, is similar.
We're going to take a quick break, and we will be back very shortly with more of this special broadcast this morning here at I-24 News. Quick break, and we'll be back. Thank you for staying with us here this morning at I-24 News Morning Edition. This is the special broadcast for day 21 of Operation Protective Edge. Still with me in studios, Colonel Richard Kemp, the former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. Thank you for staying with us. I-24 News correspondent Gabi Tartakovsky, thank you for being with us. And I-24 News senior editor Ruti Sinai. Ruti, thank you for being with us. Colonel Kemp, I want to start with you. We've been speaking a lot of course, taking from your professional experience, but personally, you've been here firsthand to witness not only the Israeli home front, but also many soldiers that have been deployed to the Gaza Strip and have been able to speak with them. How has that impacted you, not only, of course, as a professional, but also personally?
I've been working with, loosely speaking, the IDF, and have been associated with the IDF for a number of years, mainly in order that I can get a greater insight into their operations and activity, with the intention of being able to give an authoritative and objective view in the international media, which is often sometimes distorted, sometimes they misunderstand. I've been the extent to which I've been impressed by the IDF has been redoubled during this campaign. I've spent a lot of time talking to soldiers who have been fighting, who've come back from the fighting, who's about to go into the fighting, and the similarities between them and British soldiers and American soldiers, who also I've had a great deal of work with, is very striking. The sense of humour is the same. The team spirit is the same. The courage, the naked courage of these young men going in and putting their life on the line is the same, the stoicism. And I think something that's often misunderstood is the humanity, the morality is also the same as you'd find in British and American forces. Those soldiers I've spoken to, some of them have said, when we've gone into an attack in Gaza, uppermost, it shouldn't be the case, but uppermost in our minds is the need not to kill civilians. Now, that should not be the case. It should be a very important consideration. But by doing that, by having that at the forefront of their mind, is jeopardizing their own safety, because they have to think about their own safety as well, as do their commanders. And I think that's a level of morality that is rarely understood. And I mean, talking also to young soldiers going on the ground, dealing with direct hand-to-hand with Palestinian fighters and with civilians in the area. Again, they've mentioned occasions when they have specifically restrained their activity, suddenly having seen civilians there. And again, we would do the same in the British forces. Many other forces in this region wouldn't. And I spoke to a pilot not long ago who'd been firing missions in Gaza that morning, and he told me he'd aborted 17 missions because there were civilians in the vicinity of the building he was supposed to attack, and eventually cancelled the operation. And I said to him, is that not frustrating for you? And he said, no, it's not frustrating. He said, it's by far the best feature of the Israeli Air Force, because he said, I certainly could not go in, attack a target, knowing that I was going to kill civilians, and live with that for the rest of my life.
And also, in terms of Israel, they would have, set up an inquiry and commission right away. That it is something that, when the IDF does make mistakes, they also know how to set up a commission to reprimand themselves.
Absolutely, and that's one of the most important things about this country. And it's one of the big contrasts between what your enemy, Hamas, are doing and what the IDF are doing. And it also works into the feature we had earlier on about casualty statistics. The IDF and Israeli government overall have to be as accurate, honest and truthful as they can be. They're a democracy, they're accountable. And they also care about international opinion. Now, sometimes they make mistakes, sometimes they give figures that are incorrect, and everyone does the same, and it's just one of those things, and then hopefully they'll correct them. But in the case of Hamas, they will give whatever figures they think suit them at the time, and no one really cares. And if you go back to Operation Cast Lead in 2012, Hamas put forward entirely false statistics for the number of fighters versus the number of civilians that had been killed, and were then forced, under pressure of criticism for their own civilian population, a year or so later to correct those figures. So the point that Brian was making earlier on in this programme is absolutely right. Hamas are, without a question of a doubt, are falsifying the statistics, and they admit it. They've put out on websites, they've put out instructions to their supporters. Never say that a fighter's been killed. Always say it's an innocent Palestinian civilian that's been killed.
Oti?
I want to ask you something. We live in a world where bottom line is the dominating force. We examine everything in light of the bottom line, and I agree with you about the morality and so on. This is what I'm an Israeli. I grew up believing and so on. But when the world sees the bottom line, Shajaiya and other places completely razed to the ground, and Palestinian women crying to the sky, and children being brought to hospital, what good are all these claims?
Well, I agree with you. Any moral high ground that's gained by Israel, for example, accepting the Egyptian ceasefire offer, accepting humanitarian ceasefires which are then breached by Hamas, claiming this level of morality, I think all of that is nullified, absolutely nullified in the eyes of much of the world. Those are people in the world who are not prepared to listen to reason, by a photograph of a dead baby on a slab in a mortuary, or 4 boys lying dead on the beach. That is the reality, and I mean, it's tragic. There are many people being killed who should not be killed in Gaza. But from my perspective as a military man, I've seen what shrapnel does to babies, in the flesh, and it's horrible, a horrific thing. And thinking about what's happening to the people in Gaza, for me, is horrifying. But at the same time, I know that Israel has no choice apart from to attack them in this way. And the reason, and it doesn't make it any easier for the poor people that are getting killed and maimed, but the reason for many of the deaths is the way that Hamas is fighting, the way that Hamas is using their civilian population to protect their weapon systems, protect their fighters, and in some cases deliberately forcing them to remain on military objectives in the hope they will be killed with a propaganda
The question is,
vote.
I mean, you can talk yourself blue in the face, we all can, but perhaps it's time to think of some other way of making the world understand, for instance, that Hamas are really the guys with the black hats here, that they're really the bad guys, that Israel are the good guys. I mean, there has to be some different types of thinking. I think you're talking about a moral high ground is, you know, it's wonderful, but again, the bottom line is that very few people believe it.
I couldn't agree more, but what's your proposal?
I don't know. Well, I'm asking you as an expert. I mean, you're trying to help, and you're in touch with international media. I don't know. I mean, maybe we should go around and saying, you know, yeah, we're going to be.
Maybe the question, of course, is that despite the Israeli higher moral ground, at the end of the day, the pictures that are being shown around the world speak for themselves, and there really is no explaining or any moral explanation, despite how much we'll try in order to convince the convinced already.
I think that's absolutely right, and you know, I agree with what both of you are saying. It's impossible. I mean, the people that see these things are human beings, and their heartstrings are tugged by a photograph of some poor little child lying bleeding, and her parents, in great agony as a result of it. There is absolutely nothing that can counter that. In the cool light of day, those people who are making decisions about the extent to which Israel should or should not get political support, economic support, in other words, responsible politicians and business people in the countries of the world, those are the ones above all that should be appealed to through truth, through objectivity, and through logic. And that's what, as far as I'm concerned, that's a dimension I can try to bring as a military expert. I'm not an economic expert. I'm not an expert on humanitarian relief. I am on international law and military operations. And
opinion leaders, opinion shapers.
Well, Ruti, what he is saying, perhaps, and this is a good point, is also when you hear what you're hearing, who is the messenger that's bringing to you? And when Colonel Kemp says what he's saying, he is bringing it from his experience. And we do see that in the international media as well. Perhaps part of the problem is that the very conservative media in the United States, such as Fox News, they're the ones that are pulling, the argument forward for Israel, whereas the liberal media isn't as much, and thus we're already, losing the game just because we're putting, our messages through Fox News, for instance, something very right-wing.
Yeah, but again, you go where you feel comfortable, where you feel your message is going to be received or well received. Sitting with very liberal media and trying to make these same arguments about morality, they are always going to pull out the picture of the dead baby. So I don't know. I mean, I really don't know what the answer is. It's very frustrating.
I agree with you. I try my best, not necessarily with great success, to get involved in the more liberal media, certainly in the UK and globally as much as possible, because that's where I think the fight needs to be fought. Now, I'm not suggesting you could convince that many people, but it's important that the messages, at least the received wisdom, the common message, is not just continually pushed out without being challenged. But I do come back to the fact above all, we're talking about decision makers, opinion formers. There is a group that I think has the potential to be quite influential here, and other people could perhaps follow suit. It's called the Friends of Israel Initiative, and it's headed by the former Spanish Prime Minister, Jose Maria Aznar, made up of a large number of prominent former politicians, ministers, heads of state and so on, and some businessmen, who are able to use their network behind the scenes to influence current world leaders and make sure the truth is known to them, because often they're not aware of the truth either. I think that's where the main fighting ground is going to be.
We're going to get a quick update now from our I-24 News reporter, Charles Biebelser. Charles, you're on the Israeli-Gaza border this morning. Can you give us a quick update?
Hi, Yael. Yeah, just important to mention, over the course of the last 15-20 minutes, we've been hearing sustained artillery fire coming from within the Gaza Strip. So whereas this morning, when the IDF responded to the rocket fire on Ashkelon, the firing of the artillery came from outside the Strip, it seems that there is ongoing activity within Gaza as we speak. Now, it's important to remember that there are thousands of IDF troops on the ground there, and the situation remains extremely volatile. Gaza is a virtual powder keg, and really any little spark could ignite further confrontation, even though both sides have virtually declared an unofficial ceasefire.
And Charles, of course, we were hearing early in the morning you did say there was a relative quiet. Does the sustained artillery fire mean that the Israeli Defense Forces are not, as we said, a quiet night? They are starting a new tactic?
It's highly unlikely that they're starting a new operation. It's much more likely that the fire that we're hearing is coming from Beit Lahia, or the area of Beit Lahia, which the IDF targeted with the recent shelling in response to the rocket fire. And it's not inconceivable that there's been some kind of eruption of conflict there. And the shelling that you may hear may be in support of troops that may be engaged at the moment in some kind of battle.
Charles Beebles, our I-24 News correspondent there on the border between Israel and Gaza. Thank you for joining us. Earlier this morning, it was New York midnight, New York time during midnight, the UN Security Council did vote on a statement that was accepted by all, calling for an immediate ceasefire. The Palestinian representative to the UN, Riyad Mansour, had this to say, and then we'll chat about it in studio.
I am sure that you know that the number that have been killed are in excess of 1,000. Large number of them are civilians, particularly children. And the injured ones are more than 6,000. And the whole Gaza Strip in total devastation, in which thousands of homes have been destroyed or severely damaged, and hundreds of thousands of people are displaced or not having the basic elements of life.
Ruti, we do hear the statements made, and earlier we did show the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Ron Prosor, speaking, saying it's quite simple. Quiet would be answered with quiet. It's nothing more than that. Despite that, this is, of course, I would say a watershed moment in the operation, because it shows another point of diplomatic pressure that it hasn't really been seen up until now.
The UN Security Council,
right.
Yeah. Well, which we shouldn't forget was preceded by a call from President Obama to Prime Minister Netanyahu, right, saying the very same thing, basically. You know, you've got to stop this. Look, just one thing apropos of what Charles was saying before, you know, and this happens every time in every conflict with Gaza. There are always these, you know, local splinter groups that supposedly or not supposedly, you know, Hamas is unable to control, and then this is what happens sort of locally. But I think by and large, this ceasefire for the Eid al-Fitr may well be observed at least till Wednesday to allow them to allow the Muslims to celebrate. Right. About the what the UN representative, the Palestinian UN representative, was saying, you know, I think it's striking may not be the right word, that you see pictures of Gaza, and you see on the one hand, you see this horrible devastation, and you see Gaza City, where, you know, complete parts of it have been totally unaffected by this. You know, you see shops, it looks like any sort of, you know, semi-Western country. So it's not entirely true that all of Gaza has been devastated. One should keep that in mind too. Regarding the number of children, and this is a point I think everybody needs to make, is that more than 50% of Gaza's population are under the age of 18. And we have to remember this when we talk about, you know, explain why so many under 18s have been killed. You know, that's just the demographics there. And about the UN pressure, yeah, although it's not a resolution, it's an agreement. It's a step, it's a step below a resolution. But yes, I suspect, you know, if, again, you know, if the ceasefire is maintained in the next few days, perhaps there'll be an easing of pressure. But if, you know, if this starts up again, then no doubt the international pressure is going to grow.
Because when you do look at the Obama call, as you mentioned yesterday, and also the wording of the statement, it doesn't really leave Israel much choice but to simply agree.
Right.
And what are they agreeing to? They're agreeing to a very short-term plan of a ceasefire. There's nothing really in place to tell the Israeli public, which we were speaking about a poll yesterday published by Channel 10, of more than 85% of the population here want to continue with an operation.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing that, you know, Netanyahu Netanyahu has to sort of be juggling between this kind of pressure. I think, by the way, that this kind of pressure may help him vis-a-vis this popular public opinion, because I think, I think Israelis are very gung-ho at this point, but on the other hand, if a U.S. president comes and says, hey, you guys got to stop it, and it's not like we're independent in a sense. I mean, we do rely on the United States for so much, both diplomatically, economically, militarily, intelligence-wise, so it's not like we can just go and say, we're not going to listen.
Colonel Kemp, of course, when the military establishment hears of these diplomatic efforts, if one will call it efforts, one will call it strains, depending who you're asking, it does, of course, impact not only the battle on the ground, but also the decisions being made in the Defense Ministry headquarters here in Tel Aviv. Obama's calling for an immediate ceasefire, but he did also talk about disarming Hamas, something that many are on both sides of the spectrum are very skeptical about if it's even feasible to do so. Is that feasible in your eyes?
I think it's extremely difficult unless the IDF continue their inexorable progress in Gaza and defeat and destroy Hamas's military capability, which is certainly feasible. Maybe it'll take a long time. Maybe it'll take a lot of Israeli soldiers' lives. But I think one thing that people should be cautious about is, yes, of course, if there's if Hamas are prepared to accept a short-term ceasefire to come to some kind of discussion about terms, then I think Israel should go along with that. But Israel should not be drawn into a longer-term ceasefire unless there are very, very significant gains in terms of the safety and security of the people here. We've already seen, I believe the figure today is 43 Israeli soldiers killed in action. That's not a small number in a country this size. And there needs to be a very, very significant, I was going to use the word reward, but achievement, a concrete achievement as a result of it. I've no doubt the IDF have plans for all eventualities, including the continuation of this operation to the end, including what they do if a ceasefire occurs.
Because one other concern, and the Pentagon even voiced this concern yesterday, is that if you get rid of Hamas, there will be other groups there that are going to, these splinter groups, as Ulti said, they're going to take up the vacuum of leadership and power in the Gaza Strip, and they may be even more dangerous or even a less known enemy to Israel than Hamas.
I would question whether they'd be more dangerous, whoever they might be. I mean, people. There's no question about the danger presented by Hamas. And some people talk about, let's have ISIS in there, or the possibility of ISIS going in there. They could be even worse than Hamas. Well, are ISIS worse than Hamas? It's a highly debatable thing. I think Hamas obviously are a known entity. The Israeli intelligence services know a lot about Hamas and how they operate, and there are also ways of dealing with Hamas in the diplomatic sphere as well.
So in that sense, better the devil you know, which is what Michael Flynn was saying yesterday, in fact, the DIA head.
I understand that. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's better the devil you know, because it may be, who knows, maybe the replacement of Hamas may also be a devil, but it may not be as powerful and strong and dangerous a devil as Hamas. We don't know. I think it's a mistake to assume that if Hamas is eliminated, certainly militarily, then it's going to be replaced by something that's worse.
Gabi, I want to take it to you now. You have some headlines, of course, from around the conflict, around the operation that maybe have been less talked about. What are we starting with?
We're starting off with the Washington Post. It chronicles the struggle and challenges of evacuating Gaza's casualties. Jordan has been taking care of 19 Gaza badly wounded. Jordan is the only state authorized by Israel to send aid and conduct medical treatment. But it gets a bit complicated because some of the ongoing attacks force ambulance drivers to stop near casualties, and they fear to advance with their vehicles because they are afraid to be caught under fire. Families of the casualties have to provide any evidence. They don't have a prior record with the Israeli authorities, so often enough the casualties are escorted by neighbors or distant family members, and not the immediate family members of the casualties. So far, Jordan dispatched 1,000 units of blood, X-ray machines, and other medical teams and gear to improve the treatment in Gaza, and they're still trying to make as much as effort to bring more wounded to Jordan to receive proper treatment.
And Israel, Ruti, correct me if I'm wrong, has also opened a field hospital, of course.
Yeah, but it's empty. because Hamas won't let the Palestinians get there. There were 18 people treated there, and that's it. And they set up, this fairly elaborate infrastructure there, the border crossing, the Erez border crossing, and it's reinforced concrete, so it's fairly safe. But people are just not getting in there. And apropos of blood, Israel wanted to bring in supplies, as it has been doing, food and so on. They complained that on the other side there's nobody to receive them and get them to Shifa or the other hospitals where it's needed. I don't know if the Jordanian stuff is getting to where it needs to. Probably some.
Probably some. At least some are getting out, of course, and getting to Amman. What else?
Haaretz reports that Israel is again under cyber attacks, and government warns there will be an internet disruption. Okay. Cyber attacks on Israel's internet infrastructure have been going on for the last couple of weeks. The Shin Bet, Israel's security agency, which is also responsible for cybersecurity, stated there is a dramatic increase in both size and scope of these cyber attacks. Now, last week, internet providers in Israel were forced to block traffic coming from overseas for 2 hours because of the ongoing cyber threat. Now, pro-Palestinian hackers have announced Operation Israel 2 years ago, and whenever there's a dramatic conflict between Israel and Hamas, they take charge and shut down various Israeli websites, both government and non-government websites. As a response, Israeli hackers were able to shut down Palestinian websites, such as Pal Today. And this is a threat that Israel is trying its best to deal with, but it's still an ongoing situation.
And it's important to note that it's not only Israeli hackers that are employed by the government, but even hackers that startup entrepreneurs and so forth that meet together and decide together.
Yes,
a hackathon. Actually.
Yes, it's not just some computer wizards in the Israeli intelligence. It's also a concerned citizen who has a knack for hacking websites. Everyone's a volunteer and everyone's an expert in Israel.
That's a never-ending war, though, the cyber war that we see, as you said, in every conflict. They try to get the next website. What websites have been attacked in the past?
Mostly the infrastructure of Israeli internet service providers. We've seen that Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu's Wikipedia entry was hacked, and his entire bio was replaced by one giant Palestinian flag. So these are the kind of notable actions that pro-Palestinian hackers take.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll keep it only on the cyber side and not come out of the computer screens. What else do you have?
Ynet reports about Hamas instruction guides. It appears that the IDF found in the Hamas tunnels instruction guides left behind by Azzedine El-Qassam. They produced brochures to explain how to maximize explosive devices, how to choose the most effective device depending on selected targets. The guidelines include images portraying various experiments and instructions on how to conceal devices when operating within a civilian population.
Very useful.
Very useful. And just to the Hebrew, of course, of that headline is just grab a device and explode. Yeah. So not very tough instructions there.
This sort of material is, of course, shared around the world by jihadists, and technology, tactics, techniques developed in one jihad, shall we say, in, say, Afghanistan, Iraq, are shared around jihadists globally.
Right.
And
it's
also
not particularly Hamas.
No, not at all. I think, and we've seen many techniques. I don't consider this to be a light point, but the donkey bombs that we've seen in Gaza, we've seen many of them a number of them in Afghanistan before. And I think perhaps a more serious threat comes from Iran, who deliberately try and push not just munitions but also effective tactics out to those people they want to kill their enemy, for example Hamas, and also the Shia militias against British and American forces in Iraq.
Indeed. Gabi?
Yes, moving on, Energy reports that mother of fallen soldier posts on Netanyahu's Facebook page. Chava Noach, who is the mother of late Staff Sergeant Oren Noach, posted on Sunday a plea to Prime Minister Netanyahu on his Facebook page, urged him to continue with the operation, saying that
our IDF soldiers, our sons, as she mentioned it, that their deaths would not be in vain. She continued to ask, why do we agree for the ceasefire? Why not continue the job laid ahead? We know that if someone comes to kill you, you kill him first. And since she is a religious person, there are plenty of biblical references in her message, including the people of forever are not afraid of the long road ahead, and we must destroy the terror infrastructure. So far, her plea received more than 100 of likes. And it's very interesting because apparently she didn't wait for Israeli officials to come and console her, as we've seen many times before in the past, that some Israeli officials come to the Shiva during the
7 days of mourning.
During 7 days of mourning following the funerals, and she was pretty
forward with
proactive about it. She didn't spare any words regarding her views and her criticism.
And that, of course, does impact public opinion greatly, and of course maybe Netanyahu as well, in a sense.
Yes. Last item, Israel Hayom tells an interesting story about an anonymous man giving 1,000 shekels to every casualty in the hospital. A man named Ilya came with his wife and daughter on Saturday to the Sheba Medical Center in central Israel. Witnesses claim the family held dozens of envelopes containing cash.
We should get Olmert involved.
Yes, I mean, the police should be notified about this kind of man. Apparently, Ilya's daughter entered the various rooms in which IDF soldiers were hospitalized and gave them envelopes full of cash.
Well,
can I comment on that as well?
Sure. Quickly.
I think that's so important that people, the public at home, are seen by physical means to be going out of their way to support what the soldiers are doing, and talking to soldiers on the border who have received many gifts and packages. The effect on morale is phenomenal.
The IDF has even said, stop sending us food, we're all good. That's enough of that. Thank you all to all my panelists this morning. We will be back tomorrow for another edition of I-24 News Morning Edition. I'm Yael Wisner-Levy. Next up are the headlines.